Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I talked about the circumstances of the Federalist Party heading into the election of 1800 and how the combination of division within the party over how to handle the quasi-war with France, general infighting between the factions of the party led by Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and the party's rejection of mass democracy as a good form of government cost it dearly in the elections of 1800. I also discussed the reasons the Democratic Republicans found favor with the voting public and came to win control of Congress handily, despite the leaders' embrace of France and the public's anger over the XYZ affair and the quasi-war with France. And I explained the precarious nature of the presidential election of 1800. I talked particularly about the tie that happened in the Electoral College between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson and the constitutional crisis that seemed to create. I talked about how the deadlock was ultimately resolved and why the results of the election have caused it to be called the Revolution of 1800. In this episode, I will cover the primary principles of Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans as they took power in 1801. I will talk about how much they decided to change about the character and operation of the federal government as they implemented their own governing philosophy, and I will discuss the ways in which their choices during Jefferson's first term represented a dramatic shift in vision for the United States from the Federalist one. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe. If you are enjoying the show and you would like to help me continue to do it, subscribing and spreading the word are the two best things you can possibly do. So if you have not already subscribed, if you're one of the number of viewers that has come back to watch it but hasn't subscribed yet, I'd love it. I'd really appreciate it if you went ahead and hit the subscribe button, like the show if you're enjoying it, and if you know any friends or family that you think might be into it, man oh man, would I be grateful if you would let them know about the show. Thanks very much. I appreciate your time as always, and I'll keep putting together the content that I hope you're really enjoying. As I do at the beginning of every episode, I'm going to let you know the resources that I use to put the episode together and give you a question to consider as I'm going over the information. The resources really have not changed all that much. I'm still using The American Pageant, which is a common AP US History textbook. I'm also using Give Me Liberty, which is another common AP US History textbook. I'm still using the John Adams biography by David McCullough called John Adams. I'm using the Thomas Jefferson biography, The Art of Power, by John Meacham. And I'm still referring to Empire of Liberty, one of the books in the Oxford History of the United States series, the one that covers this period, specifically 1789 to 1815. And, as it happens, the title of the book, Empire of Liberty, comes from an expression attributed to Thomas Jefferson, who talked about the United States as it was expanding as an Empire of Liberty. That's where the title of the book comes from. So those are the resources I used to put the episode together. The question that I think it would be good for you guys to consider to help maybe organize the information a little better, maybe commit it to memory a little more effectively, is as follows. What was Thomas Jefferson's and the Democratic Republicans' vision for the country as they took control of the federal government, and what specific actions did they take to execute this vision as they sought to take the U.S. in a very different direction from the Federalist program? I'll say that one more time. What was Jefferson's and the Democratic Republicans' vision for the country as they took control of the federal government? And what specific actions did they take to execute this vision as they sought to take the United States in a very different direction from the Federalist program? So think about that as I'm going through this stuff. I think it'll help you to get a little bit more out of the information that I'm providing. Okay? With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the main stuff. So, as you can probably gather from the question and from the way that I've framed what is going into this episode, Thomas Jefferson is going to be a very central figure. The central figure of this episode, of the next few, because he is the most central figure, I think you would have to say, in the first quarter century of the 1800s. He organized the Democratic-Republican Party. He was the guy who inspired it, who came up with most of its most important principles, and he was the party's first president, and a guy who everyone in the party to some degree or another embraced in terms of his ideology and the things he wanted to do with the country. Given that, I think it's important to just discuss what he thought about where the country was going and what his ideology was. It's something I want to get into here for a few minutes. Those of you who have been watching the show for a while now know that I have, shall we say, mixed feelings about Thomas Jefferson. The charge of hypocrisy is very easy because he talked about all men are created equal and yet owned human beings. He's not the only one who talked that way and owned people. So I don't think that really sets him apart in any especially notorious fashion from other people that we might talk about in this period. One of the things that I have talked about as something that bothers me about Thomas Jefferson is the way that he operated politically, which was not to confront people directly, not to say to someone, hey, I really disagree with you. I think this thing you're doing is foolish. It was rather to kind of work behind the scenes and get other people to say what he wanted to say and kind of make them the bad guys and not himself, which I have a problem with. I think that if you disagree with somebody, especially if you're a person in a position of great power, you have a duty to hash it out with other people in positions of great power. That's what leadership is, in my mind. And that's not to say that Thomas Jefferson executed no form of leadership, but there are many instances in which he opposed somebody, he opposed some idea, he did it behind the scenes, he denied it to the person or people who he disagreed with when he spoke to them, but he operated behind their backs in a way that clearly demonstrated he didn't agree. He also was kind of a lying little duplicitous bitch boy. Okay? I'm sorry, that's just how I feel. For instance, when Abigail Adams confronted Jefferson after his presidency with the accusations that he, Jefferson, had paid to put all of this negative information about John Adams in 1800 out there in the press, which he very much did that, Jefferson denied it. And he did stuff like that pretty frequently. So he couldn't just man up and outside of the bounds of politics, now that he's retired, now that he's a private citizen, just say, yeah, I did that. I regret it. It was bad. He lied. He's so concerned with his image. And that's another thing too. He's one of these guys that just could not handle criticism, which, man, you're in the wrong fucking business. If you're in politics and you can't go up there and get behind what you believe and have people come at you and stand up for what you believe. I don't know that a guy like Jefferson would have been able to survive in the 20th century and beyond as a politician because you have to stand up there and take the slings and arrows of people who disagree with you. So those are some of the reasons that I have problems with Thomas Jefferson. This gets into it a little bit more because this is really kind of the absolute core of why I have trouble just looking at Jefferson as this great founding figure. As Republicans campaigned for offices all over the country in 1800, there was a mantra that they repeated ad nauseum over and over again, regardless of where or for whom they were campaigning. And it was this: Jefferson and Liberty. You get that? So you vote for Jefferson, you're creating a more liberated society, a freer society where everybody is going to be able to do what they want. And as he talked about a lot, these old world distinctions of class and elite privilege and all that sort of thing, they're not going to be as big of a deal anymore. They're not going to matter as much. So he campaigned that way, and so did Democratic Republicans. And then when he was inaugurated, he talked about how the United States was the world's best hope and how it had the strongest government on earth. Those are direct quotes, which would create a country that would soon become a beacon of liberty for the whole world. And he was very fond of lofty rhetoric like this, and I truly believe that he believed it. He was an idealist. This is what he wanted. However, maybe you've encountered people like this in your life. I certainly have. People who have the best of intentions in the world, talk about all these great things that they want to do, and who genuinely believe that they are doing those things, that they are working toward making a better world, but who have very big blind spots when it comes to how their actions are actually carried out in the world, how what they do and what they talk about actually affects people. And they are so either focused on whatever amazing, wonderful things they think that they're going to do, or so unable to look past those things and see what is on the periphery or what surrounds what it is they're trying to do, that they are just incapable of recognizing their shortcomings and who they might be leaving out and what damage, intentional or otherwise, the things they want to achieve might be causing. I have known people like this my whole life, and I can think of lots and lots of public figures like this, and Jefferson definitely fits this bill. Because as I read all of these things about Jefferson, about he wants to create an empire of liberty, about how he wants to create the freest society that has ever existed, as I read things like this, or hear quotations attributed to Jefferson in documentaries or whatever, about how America is going to be this beacon of liberty and freedom to the rest of the world, I don't find myself thinking about John Locke or Thomas Paine or other luminaries of the Enlightenment who talked about how this new world of governance is going to make things better for all people. I instead find myself thinking about one of my favorite late-night comedy regulars, and certainly my favorite puppet of all time, Triumph the Insult Comic Dog. Now you might ask, John, how in the hell are you thinking of a puppet dog when you listen to Thomas Jefferson talk? Well, one of Triumph's regular bits, if you are familiar with Triumph, is that he likes to say something that he clearly doesn't believe, and then follow it up with, "For me to poop on." For example, he might say, "That's an adorable outfit. For me to poop on!" If you know, you know. You've seen it. Well, when I hear Jefferson talk about his conception of freedom and liberty and how great republics are and how the United States will be a truly democratic republic, all I'm thinking as he's saying different versions of America's going to be the greatest country ever is how much I want to say in the Triumph voice, "For white people!" Because that's really when you dig down and examine all the things that Jefferson did, what he stood for, the actions he actually took, clearly what he meant, though he didn't say it that way. Now, Jefferson certainly wasn't alone in his gigantic blind spot for who he considered legitimate Americans and who would benefit from all these great things he and his party planned to do for the country. But he was the leader of the party. And he also never passed up an opportunity to extol the virtues of Republican government. And if you're going to talk the talk all that much, it's worth it to see, are you walking the talk? He even went to great lengths to remove the pomp and formality from the office of the president and from the federal government writ large to demonstrate what a good democratic Republican he was. He sold the fancy carriage and the beautiful horses that Washington and Adams had used to travel around. He dressed very informally his entire presidency, from what I understand, even when meeting foreign diplomats or dignitaries. But all this stuff that he did, dressing very informally, trying to present himself as a man of the people, selling the fancy carriage and the horses, it all just seems to me like cosplaying Republican democracy, rather than actually committing to it through actions that are meaningful in the lives of all Americans and not just white Americans. Jefferson knew, spoke about, wrote about, and clearly planned his version of democracy to be one in which white Americans would benefit from the many ways in which African Americans and Native Americans would not only fail to experience the white version of liberty and self-determination Jefferson talked about and took so many steps to create, but these non-white people would also be the sacrificial lambs that would make Jefferson's utopian vision of the American Republic possible. Jefferson had basically given up pushing for abolition of slavery. He did at least talk the talk for a while about that. In 1784, for example, he had his own version of the Northwest Ordinance that sought to get rid of slavery from that part of the American territory, the old Northwest, what is now the Midwest. But by the time he got back from France, he pretty much gave up on talking about abolition because he saw it as politically impractical. Now, maybe you could say, okay, that's a man of his time and he's trying to get stuff done and he doesn't want to ice skate uphill, so to speak. But if you're going to be the father of all men are created equal, and if you're going to talk all this noise about getting rid of traditional limits on average people in society and making America the freest place ever in the history of the world and a beacon of liberty to everywhere else in the world, I feel like you can't just ignore stuff like slavery. I feel like you need to actually do something to address it. And by the time Jefferson got back from France, he acknowledged on numerous occasions the crucial importance of slaves for growing the economy, bringing more land under cultivation, and expanding westward. As president, he was residing in a living example of how slave labor, employed prominently in creating Washington, D.C. out of just utter wilderness, was contributing to the future grandeur of white society. And he wasn't real consistent in all of his rhetoric about Republican democracy and political revolutions to expand it either. Jefferson completely changed his tune about liberty and freedom and the revolutions meant to create them when it came to the Haitian Revolution. Though he couldn't shut up about the nobility of the revolution taking place in France, no matter how bloody or autocratic it got, he never gave any sort of similar blessing to those breaking free from human bondage and trying to create their own Republican democracy in the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And that's even as they pursued the same goddamn goals as people in the French Revolution and the American Revolution had. There was only one difference. See if you can spot what it was. As president, Jefferson went completely in the opposite direction when it came to Haiti. Not only did he not support it, he actively pushed back against the Haitian Revolution. And he refused to recognize the country's independence, and he instituted an embargo on trade with Haiti, which did a lot of damage to the country in its early development and to the revolutionary cause. And he probably did this because slavery was kind of an accepted fact at that point in the United States. He probably did it because he was a Southerner and he knew how important slavery was to many people in the South. He probably did it also because he saw the United States' relationship with France as being in jeopardy if he embraced the Haitian Revolution. And he probably also did it because he personally, well, I think you know by now. And then there's Native Americans, who Jefferson consistently described as noble, whatever the hell that means, and whom he also thought of as clearly an obstacle to westward expansion and the availability of cheap farmland for the citizens of the Democratic Republic of the United States, who truly mattered, white people. Jefferson frequently wrote and talked about the necessity of getting American Indians out of the way, and just assumed that they would take money for their land or that they'd have to be forcibly removed from it when he arranged for the Louisiana Purchase. And when he did the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 from France, there is no evidence that I have seen that he gave even a nanosecond's thought to how he might accommodate the Native Americans who lived in that territory. And at that time, in 1803, that region, the modern plains and Midwest of the United States, was heavily populated with Native Americans, much more so than the territory that had composed the United States east of the Mississippi River up to that point. Clearly, he didn't think all that much about what would happen to Native Americans when he made that decision. He just thought it would be good for the United States and for white people. So yeah, I'm a little cynical about Jefferson's tendency to wax poetically about democracy and the wonders of Republican government, as he clearly had no intention of affording real participation in the American Republic to anyone who wasn't white. It's just something I felt the need to mention before I start explaining what he did as president, because I think it really matters who his vision for the country included and who it very definitely did not. So I think we should all take the concept that is referred to as Jeffersonian Democracy with a grain of salt. Or, as Triumph the Insult Comic Dog might say, Jeffersonian Democracy for white people! Sorry, I had to. Okay, now that I've engaged in my requisite Jefferson bashing, let's get into the stuff he actually did as president. So Jefferson and the Democratic Republican leaders had a few guiding principles that tended to determine the sorts of actions they would take as they grasped the reins of federal power for the first time. Probably the most important of these were four things. Number one, powerful people traditionally in control of governments were those primarily responsible for the suffering and exploitation of most people in most countries. Number two, that those with money and education were not morally or intellectually superior to common folks who lacked either or both of those things. Number 3, that there was more wisdom and justice in decisions made by the majority of people in a society, though minority rights must be protected from the tyranny of the majority. And number 4, that government worked better when it was closer and therefore more responsive to the people. So those 4 principles, in some way, shape, or form, help to explain a lot of the things that the Jeffersonians and Jefferson himself did when they were in power. As you might be intuiting from these points, Jefferson was deeply suspicious of the power of the federal government in the United States. He was deeply distrustful of powerful centralized institutions in general, and especially those that operated under the auspices of government authority, like standing armies or central banks. And he very much preferred institutions like the individual state governments of the various United States, which he saw as the best governments in all the world. Additionally, Jefferson had always thought of the national debt as a tool for oppression that could be used as an excuse to keep taxing people with duties like the excise tax in order to pay off the debt. Jefferson despised the excise tax from the moment that Hamilton proposed it, and he thought that the more taxing and spending authority the federal government took on, the more it and the elites who controlled it, that is the federal government, would wield great power that could be used to diminish the democratic authority of common people. He always thought it was kind of a seesaw thing. The more power you give to big institutions controlled by powerful people, the less power and authority you grant to the people. So it makes sense that if Jefferson sees the federal government as this potential leviathan of tyranny, that he's gonna try to shrink it. That's what he goes about doing. He cut spending as much as he possibly could. He moved to eliminate the excise tax almost immediately, and he pared down the staff of the federal government to a great degree. For example, Jefferson eliminated all tax collectors and inspectors employed by the federal government, which cut overall Treasury Department employees by 40%. And that had to feel pretty good to him and to a lot of the Republicans who always thought of the Treasury Department as being associated with their arch nemesis, Alexander Hamilton. He reduced the diplomatic establishments to 3 missions, and that was it. The one to Spain, the one to Britain, the one to France. So we only had diplomatic, formal relations with those 3 countries, because that was another way in which Jefferson thought the federal government could be tyrannical, by controlling our involvement with, or maybe even conspiring with, foreign governments. This reflected Jefferson's utopian, and I think, honestly, stupid, vision of universal peace that would be achieved with only commercial relations with foreign nations. He thought that if republics especially only had trade relationships with one another, the world in general would become much more peaceable, there'd be no more wars, and it would be great, and everybody would come around to a communal worldwide fire and sing Kumbaya. Of course, that sounds ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. And if you look at the world today, there's plenty of republics that trade with each other a lot that don't necessarily get along. Additionally, Jefferson and the Democratic-Republican Congress vastly reduced the sizes of both the Army and the Navy, though Jefferson did sign the Military Peace Establishment Act of 1802 into law that created West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. Even this, though, had a kind of Republican bent or emphasis to it, because Jefferson saw the need to inculcate Republican spirit into the military by training an officer corps that might not have the means for college, right? I mean, if you think that all of your officers are going to be trained at some collegiate institution, and the vast majority of people at this time did not go to college. So only elites would probably come from that collegiate institution. By making it a public one and making it essentially free for people to go there, you could open up the possible demographics of folks who could attend and then have places of import of authority in the U.S. military. And that idea very much appealed to Republican Jefferson, who wanted to have the people in control of everything that they could be in control of. You might remember that I mentioned in the negotiations for how the Electoral College tie would be resolved, now Jefferson eventually won in the House of Representatives, that maybe possibly there were some promises made by Jefferson to the Federalists. One of those promises was about how many Federalists he would keep in the government. Essentially, that he would not just purge the government of all Federalists who had bureaucratic positions, those that are not political. Despite possibly pledging not to purge the government of Federalist employees, Jefferson dismissed 46% of those in positions he could appoint in order to bring in party loyalists. Now, for context, that ranks about the same as the rate of federal employment turnover as was seen in the Jackson administration. And Jackson is sort of the go-to guy for handing out government jobs as favors to people that helped him get elected. He started what we call the spoils system that was in place for most of the 19th century. And the 46% that Jefferson got rid of to bring in his people is pretty identical to what Andrew Jackson did, which Andrew Jackson at the time kind of shocked everybody with how many people he fired. Although, given what I just told you, I don't know how it could have been that shocking. But Jefferson did get rid of a lot of old Federalist hands and put his people in place. Some of his own party members thought he didn't do enough of it, actually, but he kind of split the difference between what the hardcore people in his party were asking for in terms of putting Democratic Republicans in positions in the federal government and what he wanted to do as kind of a moderating force. More importantly, Jefferson convinced the Republican Congress to overturn the Judiciary Act of 1801. He stalled, did Jefferson, on awarding judicial appointees their offices, William Marbury anyone, and supported and encouraged the impeachment of 2 judges, including Justice Samuel Chase of the Supreme Court. Because Chase said some things about what the Democratic Republicans were doing in a way that Jefferson thought was untoward for a justice to do from the bench, Jefferson thought he should be impeached. He suggested it to people in the House, and they went ahead and did it, although Chase was not convicted, thankfully, because that would have set a pretty bad precedent that a justice of the Supreme Court could be thrown out of office just for speaking his mind in a way that people in the executive branch didn't like. Jefferson also moved quickly to give relief to those convicted under the Sedition Act. He pardoned a number of those convicted under the statute, which, remember, he protested, though anonymously, in the Kentucky Resolution, although he made the mistake of not doing more to modify the fines of James Callender. And I will get to how spectacularly that backfired in the next episode or two. Now, if all this sounds like an OG version of libertarianism, congratulations, you win the Political Science Nerd Award. But seriously, Jefferson was and continues to be a hero of those who love what has been called, for a long time, classical liberalism, and which in the modern world is very associated with libertarian politics. And that is, I would briefly define it as people who favor very limited government, and by that I mean government intrusion into the personal lives of citizens, or even like the business lives of citizens. They also tend to favor laissez-faire capitalism, that is to say, very limited government intervention into the economy, and these are folks who tend to describe themselves as socially liberal and fiscally conservative. So Jefferson was and kind of is a hero to folks who describe themselves as libertarians even now. The Jeffersonians, Jefferson himself, did make a lot of changes. But it is worth noting, and this is where I think Jefferson deserves a lot of credit, much as I have some problems with the man, there's a reason he is as renowned and as important a figure in our country as he is. He deserves his flowers for a lot of things. In spite of all the changes that Jefferson and Democratic Republicans brought to the federal government starting in 1801, it warrants mentioning all the things that they didn't change. And this is very much, I think, to their credit. Jefferson was conscious of the fact that, much like Washington, he would be setting precedents. In his case, it would be the precedent of what happens when a new faction takes control of the federal government from an opposing faction that had very different ideas about how to run things. Jefferson was aware of the danger of setting a precedent that new regimes in the presidency or in Congress would or could destroy or completely deviate from what the previous government had instituted. He understood that it would be dangerous and counterproductive to set an example of torching all or most of what prior administrations or Congresses had done. You didn't want to have, and I think you still don't want to have, this cycle of, oh, Administration X did this, we're Administration Y, and we disagree with all that, so we're just going to burn it to the ground and start all over again. Because then it's hard for the country to make significant progress. I think the example that Jefferson said is you change some things, and some things, even if you don't necessarily like them, you leave in place and maybe over time you alter them, but don't just take a wrecking ball to them. So even though Jefferson vehemently disagreed with most everything the Federalists did while they were in power, he picked his spots in terms of where to make changes. For example, though he was generally very suspicious of banks and centralized government authority, he chose not to revoke the charter of the Bank of the United States or liquidate its assets. He kept it in place, and it survived, I think it was until 1811, when it was finally not rechartered. Jefferson, like a lot of Southerners, like a lot of agrarian people, was extremely suspicious of banks, mostly because he didn't understand them. But his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, was pretty prudent in terms of finance and really pushed Jefferson to keep the bank in place because Gallatin, understood the good that it was doing for the country. So that's one of the reasons Jefferson didn't get rid of it, on top of the fact that he understood that he didn't just want to start afresh with everything. Likewise, Jefferson did not rescind the tariffs put in place under the Hamiltonian Plan, nor did he seek to invalidate or negotiate down the debts the Federalists had incurred under the original plan to fund the Revolutionary War debt, both for the national and state governments at par. He also honored the debts the Federalists ran up during the military buildup over the quasi-war with France. Though he did actively reduce the financial footprint of both the Army and the Navy when he took office in 1801, he didn't try to just invalidate the debts as they had been accrued during the Federalist government. He understood that that would be bad business and that, again, you don't just want to completely undo everything that your predecessors did. As much as I've criticized Jefferson, there's a lot of positive things he contributed, and again, he deserves the credit and his place in history for a lot of those things. And he was smart and savvy enough to understand that the continuity from presidential administration to presidential administration and Congress to Congress would be important for the long-term stability of the Union and the federal government in general. As much as he disagreed with Federalist policies, he swallowed his pride and his idealism and even came to see the wisdom of some of the things the Federalists had done, as we will get into when we talk about his embrace of executive authority in other places during his presidency. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Thanks very much for watching as always. I really appreciate your time. Again, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. If you would like to reach out to me, you can do so at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com with any suggestions or feedback or questions or anything like that. I'm happy to hear from all of you. Or you can leave me a voicemail or send a text message to area code 951-525-5536. I'd love to hear from y'all in any way you choose to communicate. Thanks again for watching. Take care, and I will see y'all next time.